In this video, we're going to highlight patterns and similarities between the most successful commanders in PDH. But first, as always, I'd like to address some responses to my last video on how to build a mana base. Alcadron, Rules Committee member and host of the PDH pod, was surprised that I was taking Crystal Grotto and Tikasia's Dig Site out of decks, because they're some of the first things he adds. I'd just like to reiterate that I was only saying how I build my mana bases. I'm very conservative with my colorless lands so that I can keep my tapped land count to a minimum. Scarecrow, another Rules Committee member, also chimed in to say that he's observed that decks that don't need to curve out and play up to 2 tapped lands before turn 5 without consequence, and that playing a higher number of tapped lands can save games that you'd otherwise be hamstrung in, and that's less of an issue if you're not playing against turbo decks, which makes it more of a personal preference. I wholeheartedly agree that it's a personal preference. That was something that I really struggled with making the video. I don't think that there's a true consensus on mana bases, so I just tried to focus on what I do. Everyone has a different playstyle, and that will affect how you construct your deck. Thanks guys, now on to the main topic, selecting a commander. To help me with this, I've asked Derek to chime in. Derek is another member of the Pauper Commander Rules Committee. This is the third member of the Rules Committee I've mentioned so far in the video. That's one benefit of the format being small and having a large Rules Committee. They don't just decide bans, they're some of the biggest aficionados of the format, so they show up pretty much everywhere PDH is discussed. But I'm not bringing Derek on because of his title. I've come to really respect his perspective, so I asked him to help me out on this one.
Hello to all the Paupers out there. My name is Derek, aforementioned member of the Pauper Commander Rules Committee. I'm really a brewer first and foremost and have built a reputation on finding unique angles on which to build decks out of otherwise overlooked commanders. So I'm really excited to be joining Lobbert here on this topic and am excited to share some of my insight on how to assess different commander options and hopefully enrich the overall experience of playing Pauper Commander.
Let's get started. My favorite commanders have been force multipliers, which can take many forms. In Maja, Bretigard Protector, we see that her second ability makes a 1/1 whenever a land enters the battlefield, effectively adding text to every ramp spell and fetch land. What I think makes her an extra good example of this is that she also has an Anthem effect, which adds a stat buff to every creature in your deck, multiplying their effectiveness.
So I think this is a good place to interject concerning Kindred commanders specifically, as this concept of force multipliers is particularly relevant. There are a lot of commanders out there for a bevy of creature types that function as nothing more than simple lords, creatures that provide just a stat line bonus. While these creatures like Legion Lieutenant or Merfolk Mistbinder are low-hanging fruit, I think it's a really good idea when building Kindred decks to start with those Kindred payoffs in the command zone that extend beyond that simple stat line bonus and provide those force multipliers, or introduce additional avenues of synergy that can contribute to a more three-dimensional deck. Marrow Reachery, I think, is a great example as a Merfolk commander that provides a traditional, lordly +1/+1 bonus, but also introduces an untap trigger on Merfolk cast, which allows us to rapidly deploy lower mana value Merfolk by untapping our lands. This is where the real power of this creature lies, with the average creature quality being lower, mitigated by the stat line boost from the Reachery. Indulgent Aristocrat as a vampire commander provides a much richer vampire deck building experience in the sense that it has a force multiplier with the entire color black. Provides a sacrifice outlet in the command zone that simultaneously grows all of your vampires and plays to all of Black's strengths in the process through graveyard synergies and popular, scam, quote-unquote, or grave flicker spells, among others. Two-dimensional Kindred commanders ultimately make for two-dimensional Kindred decks, and I think finding those that allow for additional synergies are going to make for a more robust and dynamic gameplay experience.
A bad example of a force multiplier is Wistful Selkie. You could make the ability repeatable by filling your deck with flickers, but no actual work is being done by the spell to begin with, so you've added draw a card to nothing, effectively making your spell a cantrip, but nothing else, which is really bad. You could return it to your hand with Ancestral Statue and also get a body, but if I saw a 4 mana 3/4 with the ability to pay 3 more to draw a card, I would never put that in a deck. You could also do what I did in my Flametongue Kavu deck. It's also a non-repeatable enters ability, so to make it repeatable, I get extremely aggressive with it by attacking. I included lots of artifact ramp to replay it, and Voltron elements to either incentivize having my opponents expend resources putting it back in the command zone for me, or lose to it by getting hit by it. But honestly, that deck just isn't that powerful. After many games, I figured out that Flametongue Kavu's biggest contribution was that it had 4 power and made people want to avoid dealing with it. I think that's because that was the proactive part of the card. My original plan was to use it to stall out the game and win with large X spells like Rolling Thunder, but that was reliant on me drawing one of 5 copies of Fireball in the deck. I included quite a bit of card draw and looting to compensate, but every game I had access to a 4-power attacker and saw more success as I leaned into that. But like I said, the proactive side of that card just doesn't stack up. If I try to think of more successful red decks, Zada, Hedron Grander, and Dargo the Shipwrecker come to mind. Dargo's power and toughness dwarf Flametongue Kavu, and it's more likely to be played before Kavu in a game due to its first ability. On top of that, it has Evasion and Partner for even more value. That's not to say that we should all be playing the highest power creature possible, though. Being proactive takes many forms. If you read Zada, its ability gives you a clear path to victory. Get bodies into play cantrips to refill your hand, and use those bodies to kill your opponent. Even the top commanders that appear to be more related to generating advantage, such as Gretchen Titchwillow and Malcolm, are actually combo pieces, with Gretchen being an outlet and Malcolm enabling an infinite damage and mana combo. There are some exceptions to this that have seen success though. Aranis and Sivers come to mind, and I think that they demonstrate well how high the bar is to run your opponents out of resources. If you're not familiar, Aranis is commonly combined with Street Urchin, which turns into her death-touching machine gun, and Sivers' ability is a proactive plan if your opponents don't give you the card, but otherwise it's just tons of extra cards. Aranis comes the closest to actually being able to control the whole table, but it runs into an issue that many removal-based commanders do, where the table never lets your commander hit play because they all share that same incentive. Aranis stands apart because it is powerful enough to keep up with that, but it's a pressure that other removal-based commanders crack under because achieving that goal doesn't even win you the game. You still have to do that. I try to pull most of my example out of what's successful by looking at tournament results and data on cpdh.guide, and I went searching for other removal-based commanders and thought of Armix Filigree Thrasher. Across all partners, there are 13 games logged, and only one of them is a victory. It's also worth noting that Armix having Partner effectively gives them an extra card in their opening hand, and it's still not enough to outvalue their opponents. When I was looking through the cpdh.guide data, Floodgate seems to have a much higher success rate because, like always, blue doesn't play fair. The only thing your commander asks your deck to do is play bounce and flicker spells so the deck can be dedicated to the flicker combo. But most other decks don't have such a reliable way to win the game in the 99, and there's just a huge difference between what you can do with an uncommon that always starts in your hand. If we look at the popular mid-range deck lists, we find Third Path Iconoclast, Sivris, Sir Conrad, and Dalek Squadron. Third Path Iconoclast generates value in attackers and blockers, and incentivizes you to play the same spells that make the pingers good, and the rest of these commanders drain the table. Sivris has the lowest win rate out of these, maybe because the damage is optional. Sir Conrad is hard to quantify, but Dalek Squadron is easy. It's about 3 damage to each opponent per turn, and we see that again on Loyal Subordinate, where there's no extra cost to drain the table for 3 every turn, so that you're free to play your deck is enough to be top tier. That's even a benchmark that I sometimes test my decks against.
So competitive, casual, or, really anywhere in between, the through line is that you first need to have a clear idea about what you want your commander to accomplish. At that point, it's all about optimizing towards that end. On the competitive side, that goal tends to be a little more concrete and quantifiable, like, are you hitting predetermined thresholds or play patterns consistently, for example? In a more casual environment, optimization is still just as important. Every deck has goals, and your commander should just be the embodiment of those goals as you interpret them through gameplay. With Loyal Subordinate versus Dina Soul Steeper, for example, if the goal is just to drain out your opponents as fast as possible, Loyal Subordinate is probably going to be a better choice. If you want to establish a slower engine that sacrifices speed for resilience and durability, Dina may be more optimal in that situation. The real difference just hinges more on a metagame analysis than power level in a vacuum. Optimizing for a casual experience is much different, and I'd argue much more intimidating for an average player. It really involves identifying the things that you as an individual positively respond to in a game of Commander, and finding a commander that actively enables those experiences. A common example I use when trying to explain this phenomenon is my affinity for the tactile elements of Magic. I like to manipulate my cards, whether they are on the battlefield, top of my library, graveyard, wherever. Mechanics like Surveil, Scry, Discover, and Explore always scratch a very specific itch for me, and cards that involve tapping and untapping my creatures for value have that effect in much the same way. These things not only inform the way that I design a deck for casual play, but also do a tremendous amount of legwork in actually selecting the commander itself. For example, like Sky Hussar or Wrath Weatherlight Stalwart lean really hard into untapped synergies that I really enjoy, and decks built around either are going to have marked differences, but ultimately provide a consistent experience optimized for very specific interactions. If I want to lean into a more spell-heavy or token-centric route, Wrath is probably a better choice. However, if I'm not particularly interested in buffering my spell count to reliably take advantage of Wrath, I'd probably err more towards Sky Hussar, which plays a bit better with a creature-heavy board, while being an evasive threat in and of itself. The deck I'm most known for in the format, Heritage Druid, is an elf Kindred deck that functions specifically by taking all of my elves and turning them sideways to generate mana. If a commander has the words tap and untapped whatever on it, I'm probably in 100%. Really, a deep understanding of what makes each of us tick as a commander player can also be leveraged out of the casual realm and into a competitive space, if that's what you want to do. Dragon's Rage Channeler, for me, I think is another perfect example. The constant top deck fiddling checks that tactile box for me, while also providing a really great virtual card advantage engine upon which to build a more aggressive, interactive mid-range deck. A lot of creativity in the competitive metagame is driven, I think, by these casual preferences, just kind of distilled and boiled down. A thorough understanding of optimizing for a casual experience is a great on-ramp to finding those underexplored competitive commanders that are really just waiting for a time to shine.
That's a great point. I often use casual pods as testing grounds for experimental decks, and bring what I learned to competitive pods. For example, I decided to build a Shardless Agent deck because I knew that no matter how I made it, it probably wasn't going to be competitive, and I wanted to see how good I could make it. It has Cascade, so I limited my deck to a small number of spells with mana value 2 or less, so I could make sure to hit something that I would consider an engine, because Shardless Agent looks a lot like Wistful Selkie, which we used as an example for being a poor force multiplier. That deck building challenge is what makes it interesting to me, but I also get to test lots of expensive spells that get cut from other decks, and come up with solutions for things to do on turns 1 or 2. I really encourage people to try out lots of decks with a bunch of different commanders. People, including myself, get really attached to a specific commander, which can sometimes prevent you from trying out similar commanders, and I know that it's hard to buy into another set of cards that you already own if the strategy is similar to what you're already doing, but building and testing new decks consistently gives me insights into other decks that I own. Even if you just build and test them on Moxfield, you'll probably learn something just by having new Scryfall searches and synergies. It's all about finding unique ways to solve problems and growing from it. Like, my Shardless Agent took advantage of what I learned from Flametongue Kavu. People don't want to let it return to the command zone, so True Faith Sensor's Vigilance made my commander something that needed to be jump blocked or let through, not killed. As a side effect of this, I got to learn about my deck's ability to function if my opponents never let me play it again, which has become something that I look for in commanders as well. The ability to still function without a commander. The example of Loyal Subordinate versus Dina comes to mind again. Both commanders need to be in play to deal damage, but Loyal Subordinate's deck still does just as much damage without it in play. The cards in Dina are more likely to be repeatable life gain or drain effects that would be better used when Dina is in play, so you're more heavily incentivized to replay them first, which gives you far fewer options during a game. That sequencing is something that I've been considering a lot more lately. When Wisp Drinker Vampire came out, Brad and Papa Popper pointed out that Cliffhaven Vampire just might be the better option, and I didn't initially believe them, but they pointed out that as 4-mana commanders, you need something to do before they come out. If you have Soul's Attendant on turn 1, Cliffhaven Vampire incentivizes you to play it immediately, but Wisp Drinker would prefer if you didn't play it until after it's in play. One way to circumvent this issue is just to play a cheap commander. After all, any increase of mana on your commander gets multiplied by how many times you play it in a game, so it should not be taken lightly.
So on the topic of cheap commanders, I think that 1 mana value commanders specifically occupy a really interesting space in the format. When you break it all down, with the fact that commanders are an entire rarity step ahead of the rest of the deck, being able to get a game plan online immediately provides a lot of leverage over the pace of the game. As someone who carries a lot of water for cards like Heritage Druid or Dragon's Rage Channeler, believe me when I tell you that that kind of consistent head start is hugely impactful to the ultimate course of the game. And by the same token, it's important to be aware that by immediately starting to, quote, do the thing, we're going to draw a lot of attention, taking so many more game actions than our opponents. And this really just leads into the second primary advantage of cheap commanders, is that they're easy to redeploy should they be removed, and they will be removed. There's an implicit resilience to these decks that isn't always apparent at first glance, but is really influential nonetheless.
We've talked a lot about being proactive in terms of card advantage and killing your opponents, but I think that there's another aspect to consider about each commander, and I think that it's a lot sneakier because more often than not, it's not written on the card. It's additional mana generation. Most top decks cheat mana with treasures, mana rocks, or land enchantments, which, like I said in my lands video, allows you to play fewer tap lands because they help with fixing on top of giving you more mana to work with. That bonus can come from cards in the 99 that synergize with your commander. I'm trying to make the video as commander-centric as possible, but you absolutely have to think forward to what you're going to include in the 99.
When we're talking about commanders that explicitly generate mana or other resources, it's important to keep in mind that consistency in play patterns from game to game is really key to a successful deck, casual or otherwise. For example, think about how awesome it is to have that mana creature or mana rock right on curve exactly when you want it. Having a mana creature in the command zone provides exactly that experience every game, and at this point, it's just a matter of deciding what we want to do with that resource advantage, since we can just count on having all the right things at exactly the right time. when I originally conceptualized my Heritage Druid deck, a deck that is explicitly about mana generation, I wanted to make sure that I could not only generate a lot of mana, but just be able to always use it and play on curve. With my list specifically, it's built to do the following things every game as consistently as possible. Play a forest, cast a 1 mana value elf on turn 1. Play a second forest, cast another 1 mana value elf along with Heritage Druid on turn 2, and then activate Heritage Druid to cast a 3 mana value spell. And then activate Heritage Druid and tap both forests to cast a 5 mana value spell on turn 3. This list plays just enough spells across all these metrics to be able to reliably meet these goals. Now, with Priest of Titania being moved up to Uncommon in Modern Horizons 3, we will gain access to it in the command zone for the first time, and just take a moment to think about just how differently those first turns might play when we always have access to a Priest of Titania versus a Heritage Druid. While I'm not sure I even fully know at this point, I am confident in saying that these two commanders are going to head up a lot of decks that look similar but play out much differently. Now again, this is all to say that having a commander that generates resources is really only half the battle. We'll always need to have a clear vision of how and when to use those resources.
Every commander can also be evaluated on their survivability. Decks like Wilson, Mystic Enforcer, and Slippery Bug will take that to an extreme by making it the primary selling point of their commander in Voltron strategies, but every commander has toughness at the very least. Board wipes at common usually deal 1 or 2 damage, so having 3 or more toughness is a decent selling point. This is another aspect where your 99 can be really important. White decks have access to versatile protection spells, blue has counter spells, and flicker decks have a built-in way to protect creatures. Mass edicts are also really common, which means something like Abdel Sword Coast Sailor especially hard to stop. Their commander has 4 toughness, is in blue, plays flickers, and generates tokens to sacrifice to edicts. I think I'll call the video there though. It feels like everything past that, we start to get too specific into an archetype, and I'll probably make individual videos for those one day. To recap, when selecting a commander, you want to keep your plan to win the game at the forefront of your mind, with removal and card draw being secondary, but still important. Sequencing can be a concern for higher mana value commanders, but having a low mana value both circumvents that and helps cheat mana, which is another aspect to consider. And finally, consider survivability and resiliency. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of unexplored areas in the format, so pick one you like, come up with unique solutions, and you might come up with a deck that nobody's ever seen before. Thank you for watching until the end. Please consider giving this video a like and subscribe for more Pauper Commander content. If you'd like to support what I'm doing here, I'd love it if you became a patron. Patreon shout out to Achu and Bill, Too Much Do. Thank you.